Let me first start by explaining that this is going to be a two-part sermon. That's because it was getting late last night, and I tried to write a shorter sermon, but I didn't have time, and I wasn't done, and it was already like at 25 minutes, and I love you too much to put you through that. So I cut it in half, and so this is Humanism 101, and on August 12th we'll have Humanism 201, okay? This is just the basics. This is sort of like the history, the backstory. And in August we'll go a little deeper, okay? I also need to explain that I was raised humanist in my family and in our congregations. From the time I was a small child, I was taught that to question is the answer. I was taught to scorn superstition or blind faith. I was taught that reason and science were the only reliable ways to find any kind of truth. I was taught that God had nothing to do with living well. Compare that to what you might have grown up in. I've got to say, it was kind of a bracing, chilly way to raise a kid. In Sunday school, we did not sing about Jesus loving us, and no one taught us how or why or if to pray. Instead, we were expected to clarify our own values. We were supposed to uphold our individuality above any group or outside of a group. And we were taught that we were going to need to pull ourselves up by our own theological bootstraps. Okay? I cannot stress enough how incredibly white and masculine all of this was. But back then, pretty much everything was defined by white men, so it just seemed kind of normal. As is often the case, as a teenager, I rebelled. Did you rebel when you were a teenager? I think that's the work of the teenager. So I took what was at hand and I rebelled against it. But, as is so often the case, as an adult, I had to go home and find out where I really came from. And for me, this meant going to Meadville Lombard Theological School, which can be argued is the birthplace of Unitarian and Universalist humanism. For me, this meant learning the names and the histories and the squabbles of the white men who had shaped my theological upbringing. For me, it was a powerful homecoming, and I am grateful for it. Grateful because it allowed me to reclaim my humanism with an adult perspective, and grateful enough that now I can challenge its incompleteness and shortcoming without rejecting. Okay? Let me also now explain that in preparing for this sermon, there was a whole lot of reading, and I really drew a lot from this book. The Making of the Manifesto, by The Birth of Religious Humanism by William F. Schultz. Bill Schultz was the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association for a while. He was the executive director of Amnesty International US, and he was my preaching professor. So, if you've ever identified yourself as a humanist, if you've ever identified yourself as a Unitarian humanist, I strongly encourage you to read this book. It's great. It made me fall in love with all those cranky visionaries all over again. No, you cannot borrow my copy. I love you, but we're going to just have to get a copy for the library. Okay, so let's go back 100 years, because right now we're currently living through the centennial of Unitarian humanism. So let's go find out how it came to pass that humanism became one of the warp threads in the tapestry that is Unitarian Universalism. Okay? Let's remember that 100 years ago, the Unitarians and the Universalists were separate. They were amicable, they were friendly. Some of them were playing footsie under the table. But they would not actually consolidate into a denomination for several more decades. Also, we need to remember that at that time, most folks who identified as Unitarian also identified as Christian. As Christians go, they were distinctly liberal, but they were emphatically theistic. They held on to their God just as firmly as any other Protestants. This is part of our history. Let's go back one century further, back into the 19th century. That was when a lot of stuff really started happening. With advanced scholarly analysis, new translations, biblical analysis and criticism began in earnest in the 19th century. And so people were beginning to see Christianity in its historical and cultural contexts. And then as the birth of psychoanalysis, understanding of the mind, Freud began to consider that gods were a creation based upon the mind's fears and wishes. And then there was the scholarly examination of other cultures, their myths, their religions, and it became obvious that Christianity was just another form of something that all humans do over and over. So that complexity started becoming apparent, that maybe humans are a religious species was starting to be considered. What made Christianity exceptional, other than it was ours? Meanwhile, industrialism is churning forward, and science and reason, the fruits of the Enlightenment, were starting to become clear that this was a path towards progress. Okay, so that's the backdrop. And now, out of all this, religious liberals began finding themselves questioning a religion that, if you looked at it closely, strip away the superstition, the miracles, these ancient stories. Some of them tried to hold on to Christianity while simultaneously rejecting an anthropomorphic, made in our own image, sky god, white guy, beard. How can we be Christians and not have that? Some of them began trying to shift away from what was clearly fallible human written scripture and maybe place authority more in our lived experience. There were a lot of non-religious non-believers also in the public spotlight. People like H.L. Mencken, Clarence Darrow, but I would say theirs was the easier work of doing atheism outside of religion. It's a much trickier nut to do it inside a religion. So with this backdrop of history and scholarship, naturally, and I'll explain why naturally, Unitarian theologians began grappling, trying to figure out new terms, new ways of understanding God, and what were the implications of non-theism or even atheism within a religious context. If anybody was going to do it, it was going to be Unitarians. And there's good reason for this. They had already survived the profound theological lurch away from the traditional Christian Trinitarian theology. They'd already become Unitarians, and then they'd managed to surf the Transcendentalists. So they had muscles built up already to do this kind of work. Because talking about disbelief, that's not easy. But if any group could do it, the Unitarians would be your best bet. I still think that. Why, we can disbelieve better than anyone. What happens when we start to believe, though? Watch out. Among those very early Unitarian humanists were men like the Reverend Frank Doane. He was teaching at what was then just Meadville Theological School in Pennsylvania. In 1908, think about what was going on in 1908. He began teaching a philosophy that he called cosmic humanism. I don't know what all it entailed, but it caught the attention of a whole generation of young ministers who then continued to spread this. And indeed, as Meadville merged into Lombard and Meadville Lombard in Chicago, became really the best place to study humanism in its historical and contemporary contexts. So you got this seminary that's starting to spew out this radical stuff, but things really got rolling from the combined impact of the Reverends John Dietrich and Curtis Reese. They both started out as ministers in other religious traditions, and it wasn't working, so they became Unitarian, and then even as Unitarians, they were pushing the boundaries. And they pushed the boundaries enough to change the direction of the denomination. They were humanists. But what did this mean? What were they talking about? What were they saying? They weren't just raw existentialists. This is what there is. That's that. And they weren't nihilistic atheists. There is no meaning. There is no God. Deal with it. They weren't saying that. They saw what they were doing as a specifically religious philosophy. They placed, for one thing, they placed humans within nature, not separate from, or what's even more tempting, above nature. And that's really different from Christianity that taught, Adam was created to have dominion over the rest of nature, so, God, separated from. So in this humanism, they cast humans as part of nature, and nature was not particularly antagonistic towards humans. Instead, it was the place from which humans arose, developed. Thank you, Charles Darwin. 19th century Unitarian. Okay, John Dietrich. His humanism was an optimistic faith in cosmic power. He wrote, the universe is growing to be something better, something higher, something finer year by year. It's a manifestation of a power that is resistless, that is working in accordance with law which is perfect and invariable, and which is constantly seeking higher levels. In other words, we may be sure that there is in the universe a cosmic power which expresses itself in a law of progress. Note his conviction that everything was progressing, improving, elevating. I want you to notice that inevitable upward movement. By 1916, John Dietrich had become the minister at the First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis, where he preached a particularly vibrant form of humanism. He drew crowds. And to this day, that congregation in Minneapolis, I attended it when I was a teenager, it remains one of our largest humanist congregations. I want us to note, though, that Dietrich did not consider himself a theist or an atheist. He just discarded that. He said, instead, he urged us to focus our religious attention not on a God, but on our abilities to change the world. And by most accounts, he was a brilliant preacher, but a really lousy pastor. He kind of expected his people to man up. Just deal with your personal problems yourself. He kind of had this brusque attitude towards death or suffering or tragedy. He just said a person should accept this with clear-eyed forthrightness. You know, just accept this as part of the natural process. So instead of turning to a faith in some supernatural religion, he urged followers to a firm and confident reliance upon themselves, in whom lie the possibilities of all things. That explains a lot about my upbringing. Meanwhile, Reverend Curtis Reese humbly delivered what he humbly considered to humbly be the first systematic humanist sermon in 1915 at the Unitarian Church in Des Moines, Iowa. His strain of humanism, because, you know, it's all new territory, you can make it what you need it. His strain of humanism cast humans as evolving towards some greater purpose, most directly perhaps to learn how to control and contribute to nature's creative process, to become co-creative. His attitude towards a God was more sympathetic. He kind of remained open-minded about deity. However, Reese advocated his followers to, here we go, place less responsibility up to God than they once did, and more obligation down to their own self-dependent minds and wills. Don't wait for God. Do it yourself. Both Dietrich and Reese faced all kinds of opposition from the traditional Unitarians back east. So if you start reading Unitarian and Universalist history, there's this really interesting kind of tension between the East, Boston, and the Midwest, where things were growing and happening. The Harvard-educated, kind of intellectual Brahmins versus the folks out on the cutting edge, up to their shins in mud. How we're going to do this happened over and over. But Dietrich and Reese, they were doing this because they truly believed that if religion was going to have any future, it needed to embrace rational thought. And it needed to come to terms with and accept scientific inquiry into the natural world. They believed that religion would have to shift, inevitably, would be shifting from theistic to humanistic. That's why they dug in. And there were fights all throughout the 1920s. But there was a lot of growth, and growth of humanism within the denomination and in the larger society. As is so often the case in movements, there were schisms and squabbles and offshoots and internecine wars. But by 1933, there were enough people who had adopted enough consistent understanding of humanism that they issued what they called the Humanist Manifesto. You could issue manifestos, much better back then. You can't do that so much now. The Humanist Manifesto, issued in 1933, it is an amazing read. 36 people signed it. One of them was even a woman. The Humanist Manifesto contains some really radical commentary on social inequality, and it includes some very profound theology, such as humanism will affirm life rather than deny it. This is in stark response to Christian theology that places human life as bad, sinful, awful, and if you're good, you get an afterlife that is better, ideal, heaven. So life denying is how they saw Christianity, that life is problem and maybe you'll have something better. The humanists wanted to say life is good. Humanism will affirm life rather than deny it. Oh, and then the manifesto wraps up with this amazing summary. The quest for the good life is still the central task for mankind. Man is at last aware that he alone is responsible for the realization of the world of his dreams, that he has within himself the power for its achievement. He must set intelligence and will to the task. Man. Anybody notice anything about that language? Kind of heavily gendered male language. Okay, we're just going to overlook that for now, okay? The manifesto contained beautiful aspirations, but when it was released, it was met with almost no fanfare, very little interest, because if you remember, 1933 was the middle of a depression. The New York Times didn't even bother with it. And there were some big-name thinkers that signed on to it, but within the Unitarian folds, the whole controversy between theists and humanists, that whole thing just kind of subsided by 1936 when Frederick May Elliott was elected to be president of the American Unitarian Association. Elliott was part of a long line of Elliott Unitarian leaders, the Elliots. T.S. Eliot rebelled and went and became an Anglican. So, makes me look kind of... But some people still think that there's this tension between our humanists and our theists and our... We settled that back in 1936 at the national level. We figured there's room enough. There's room enough. Today, there is still the American Humanist Association that issued that original manifesto. And within the UUA, there is the Humanist UU Association. They're an affiliated group. And there's a certain amount of overlap between the secular group and the Unitarian group. They're separate but friendly. There may be some footsie, I don't know. The cool thing is the American Humanist Association did go ahead and update their manifesto. They've done it twice now. In 2003, they issued the third version. And, oh my gosh, it's so cool. Knowledge of the world is derived by observation, experimentation, and rational analysis. Okay. So they updated the language, degendered it. And 92 people signed it, including 11 women. It's incremental. It's a rip snorter of a read. Really? Okay, well, okay. I think it's a rip snorter of a read. Go read it. But again, 2003, they come out with a Humanist Manifesto 3. The larger world really didn't pay much attention. But this time, I think it was because so much of what it contains had already become completely mainstream. If you go pull up a copy I think you're going to be hard-pressed to find anything in it that you would violently disagree with. It's just kind of common now. And the humanists, they've got their core values and their aspirations and their mission, and it looks like it was updated 2013. It's great stuff. You know, we're naturalists, free and responsible thought, living with joy and love. I mean, But when I read them, I still notice there's something missing. There's still something missing in these modern manifestos and aspirations. What's missing are words for the individual who is suffering. It presupposes that the individual is upright and rational and commanding their personal agency and power. These ideals have nothing to say to a person who is experiencing abuse, a person who is heavily burdened, a person who is currently oppressed. Which led somebody to say, perhaps this is a document of privilege. According to these aspirations, in a world stripped of myth and miracle, we are to celebrate with conviction that being alive is miracle enough. But they have no words to speak on where we will find comfort in times of despair. Without myth or story, how will we organize? There is no place for the blues. Instead, they simply expect that this clear-eyed view will sustain a person. I suspect some of this is a holdover from John Dietrich's kind of chilly approach to his pastoral care. You know, all right, you're feeling weak or lost or fearful or forgotten. You should just be grateful you're alive. Pull yourself together. Remember that Unitarian humanist movement began with white people, mostly white men. And while it's softened to include values such as joy and community, I'm still waiting, I'm still watching to see how well it opens up the circle to include non-white, non-male people who might actually do Unitarian Universalist humanism a little differently. Okay? Anybody who saw Susan Frederick Gray's sermon from General Assembly, she talked about how change, comes at the margins. Change, making the circle bigger, doesn't happen from the center so much as it happens on the margins. Ultimately, I will measure our success as humanists. I'm including myself in this. How I will measure my success as a humanist by the way that we treat other humans. And that is another sermon. I'll see you in August.